Hey guys, what's up? I'm back. Yeah, that's right. It's been a little while, but we're back with another episode of new decks this week, which I think I was previously calling Meta Mondays until I remembered I never actually do this on Monday. And I've made 2 changes to the site since last week's update. One of which is I've clearly defined tiers. Tier 1 is decks that dominate the meta. Tier 2 are solid decks that I'd recommend climbing with. And Tier 3 decks are decks that are climbable but will be slower and harder. I think this is pretty important to understand because I say tiers a lot, but to a lot of people that might mean slightly different things. But here's something you also might have noticed. I've added an additional one, tier ? Which is going to mean a new experimental deck, either the deck that I'm making and working with, or something that's showing up really well on the ladder stats. It's got potential. So something that I'm not really comfortable giving a tier 2, but feel free to try out. It is a new deck. And that's why I'm calling this new decks this week, because I'm going to start listing not just the meta tier list, but decks that are actually, new this week that people are messing around with that are actually doing well. Again, this is still going to be a competitive tier list, and new decks doesn't mean meme decks necessarily, but decks that we have a low sample size. We don't really know if they might stick around, but they're doing well so far. With these new decks, some of them are going to prove to be good decks that I will bump up to tier 2, and some of them won't stick around and I'll end up removing them from the tier list. So what that's going to mean is that there will be a new rotation here. I've only got 2 for now, Lulu Aggro and a new spicy version of Deep by Marcus, but basically every week or every time I feel like doing one of these episodes, I'll be rotating these either up to tier 2 or switching them out for another new deck that week. A lot of you guys have been saying that it would be cool if there were more fresh decks every week, because there are some metas where the tier list doesn't change much, so adding this section hopefully will help out a lot with that. But yeah, they're currently at the bottom. I think I need to probably reorganize this whole thing. Don't worry about it for now. So let's get into the decks this week. So if you want to try out any of these decks for yourself, if you want to play them or craft them, go to the website. In the pinned comment, it's the one you're seeing on your screen right now, and you can click on these little names and it'll take you to where you can import the decks and their meticulously crafted variants. I spend a lot of time every time I do one of these meta updates. It usually takes between 6 and 10 hours, and basically that is A, partially going through the stats, and B, also crafting each deck card by card, and that's 40 different cards. Each card is chosen with a very, very specific purpose, so make sure you're keeping your decks updated. I look through stats so much, and I see a lot of people running out-of-date versions of my decks, still running them, and it pains me, because I spend a lot of time updating it and making sure everything is perfect, but I know some of you guys aren't checking back. Anyway, with that out of the way, the broad strokes of the meta this week is, well, it's basically what I was predicting the last time we did one of these videos. There's a lot of aggro, and in part, this is to the beneficiary of many decks that are feasting on aggro. So if you can look at tier 1 right now, we've got Fearsome Spiders and Discard Aggro, recently updated the versions, but the same archetypes as you'd expect, that are dominating tier 1. But Thresh Nasus and Nightfall Aggro, 2 decks that kind of prey on aggro. Nightfall is somewhat of an aggro deck itself. It's a bit of a slower deck, but it's great in aggro mirrors, and these are decks that are rising rapidly in win rate because of their ability to counter a lot of the aggro going around on ladder. So that's pretty much this meta in a nutshell. You'll see in a lot of these decks, I'm running cards like Tasty Feyfolk and Kindly Tavern Keeper. You'll see that a lot of archetypes are lower down on the tier list, like Azir Lucian Scouts is down to tier 2 because of aggro mirrors. Pirate Burden isn't as good into aggro mirrors. We've got, Lee Sin Zoe is down to tier 3. There's aggro everywhere. And it is definitely kind of the main theme that you'll be seeing this week. So if you want to be building your own decks and making sure they're good, just make sure that they do well against aggro matchups. So at the top of the list, we've got Fearsome Spiders still. Spiders is a deck that has kind of made a major resurgence, and I actually have had the pleasure of making the highest win rate Spiders version prior to this last week. That was the one that I built 2 weeks ago and posted here. I have, however, updated it in a pretty important way, and you guys, if you've been checking the website, I've actually updated, this is one of the decks that I've been updating multiple times throughout, the last week and a half or so, but this is the final version that we've we've arrived on here, and this is the one that will be probably best into the current metagame. A couple of interesting inclusions, the most noteworthy of which being Unspeakable Horror as effectively an aggro mirror tech. Unspeakable Horror doing really well in Spider's aggro this week, and the ability for you to be able to ping down your opponent's 1 health units is actually really great. And you can also use it on the opponent's Nexus, so it's never that bad. Overall though, I mean, it's the same Spider's deck that it's always been. It's just swarmy aggro. It's very good against like aggro mirrors in general because it will race you down, but it's very disruptible, so pretty vulnerable to board sweeps. All right, next up, we've got Discard Aggro. Discard Aggro hasn't seen much of a change in the last week, but if you'll notice, we've swapped out the Legion Saboteur for the Legion Rearguard. The reason being, well, a few things. Legion Rearguard is a pretty good aggro tool, but you might ask, well, you know, why are some other decks running Saboteur still over Rearguard? And the reason is that Discard Aggro is a deck that likes keeping their units alive for the swarm abilities of stuff like Crowd Favorite and stuff like Vision. And Rearguard just ends up a little bit more survivable than Saboteur, so a little bit more preferable in what you're going to want from Discard. Tied for the highest win rate at 56%, like Spider's Aggro. It's Discard, baby. You know what you're getting. It's a pretty straightforward deck, but with a surprisingly high skill ceiling. In this case, you know, it's a swarmy aggro deck, but you have a really nice contingency of leveling up Jinx or using Augmented Experimenter to never run out of steam. And that brings us to the two biggest anti-aggro decks right now, Thresh Nasus and Nightfall Aggro. Now, I will say, in terms of how I expect the meta to kind of like shift next, I do expect the aggro craze to die down naturally, and with it, the anti-aggro craze as well. I do think that Spiders and Discard Aggro will still stay tier 1 decks, but I expect that the play rate of them will lower to the point where I'm guessing Thresh Nasus and Nightfall Aggro will be back down to tier 2 in a couple of weeks. So don't get too crazy crafting these, but they're very good right now, and who knows, maybe they'll stick around. So Thresh Nasus. Thresh Nasus comes in at a 55% win rate, and this is my personal version of Thresh Nasus right now. So basically, it's a pretty standard Endure style deck if you have played like Vehu Endure decks in the past, except we're using a little bit more of a like slightly flexible mid-range-ish strategy, and Nasus instead of Vehu Endure. Usually, you'll have a Nasus that's able to be, you know, at 10-10 or more, and because you're slaying so many units, and he'll make a really great atrocity target. Make sure you're using atrocity reactively if your opponent casts a spell first, or if your Nasus already has spell shield, so that the opponent can't counter it. But depending on its hand, it can play extremely aggressively with keeper combos off of Blighted Caretaker or Ravenous Butcher. So a bit of a slower kind of mid-rangey deck. You can play flexible in speed, but you can have some really explosive opening hands that can race down even the fastest of decks. And last but not least, we've got Nightfall Aggro. Who could have seen this coming? Nightfall Aggro actually making some real waves right now. It's been a while. Some people have said it's like a low-key deck for ages, and honestly, I think ever since Unto Dusk got added into the game, they've been right. Unto Dusk is a really powerful tool in, you know, Nightfall Aggro. Absolutely insane, because of just how flexibly it allows you to play the deck, especially like using it on Nocturne is pretty crazy. Of course, you know, using it on Doom Beast, you've seen Unto Dusk being used in a lot of different things, and it's pretty nuts. There's not that many different ways of playing Nightfall Aggro right now, but this is what I would recommend playing based off the stats and my experience. And again, you'll notice that like with pretty much every deck on my site right now, it's slightly aggro teched. We're running 3 Unspeakable Horror, and I mean, depending on the version you look at, it'll be running anywhere between 0 and 3. This is somewhat of a debatable card, but right now I'd recommend 3 Unspeakable Horror. It's great against aggro. Being able to just kill 1 health units and drain and, you know, heal back up is really nice, and it's a nice non-committal card that fits into the archetype nicely. The Flight has also been making waves as a really nice Nightfall activator for these decks. Now, I will go on the record saying I don't really like the Flight in general as a, you know, like a broad statement. Like when the card came out, I said that people were overrating it and the card was like really bad and wouldn't see many decks. And that's what happened because people realized that they were overrating it and it looks a lot better than it is. But in Nightfall, this card's perfect. The Flight is a great, cheap activator for Nightfall, and you'll get more cheap activators for Nightfall with it. And it's elusive, and a lot of Nightfall wants to play at like exactly the speed where you can just like, you know, have a nice like elusive or overwhelm or fearsome, just some unblockable win condition. Another cool bonus of the flight in this deck is that the ephemeral flight actually does basically the same thing as a normal flight. If you get an ephemeral one off of Fading Memories or Stalking Shadows for whatever reason, ephemeral flight doesn't matter, because if you're Nexus striking with it that turn when it's ephemeral, it will still activate, it'll still shuffle itself into your deck, and it'll lose the ephemeral tag when it does. So as long as you're attacking with it that turn, there's literally no difference between a non-ephemeral flight and an ephemeral one. Okay, so that's gonna wrap up tier 1 on the tier list. Now we can get into some of the tier 2 decks. Again, these are decks with still really solid decks. What did I say? Solid decks that I'd recommend climbing with. Nothing wrong with these decks, just not necessarily the most dominant decks in the game, and sometimes a little bit harder to play. So Jarvan Shen. Jarvan Shen is an interesting story. When Jarvan got buffed, I guess this was 2 weeks ago now, I built Jarvan Shen, and it did really well. It actually had a 54% win rate, the version on my site. And here I'm making a bit of an update, because Jarvan Shen's win rate has been slowly declining over the last 2 weeks due to the upsurge in aggro, and I have aggro tech this deck just a little bit harder. In this case, I'm running 2 Tasty Feyfolk. Tasty Feyfolk is kind of adorable in this style of deck just because it's a buff deck. We still have ways of being able to buff our units and keep them alive for great effect. You know, for example, you know, attacking with something like Shen or buffing it with Sharp Sight will, of course, just have a really, really good time into an aggro matchup. And you can also get lifesteal off of stuff like Single Combat or Concerted Strike with Tasty Feyfolk. So it's a little bit weird. I have run it in like Shen Demacia style decks before, like with Fiora. I've slotted in like 1 or 2 Feyfolk depending on the meta, and it's actually surprisingly decent. I think a lot of people are kind of like underrating its ability to hit this deck, and just because there's so much aggro going around right now, I've been running 2 Feyfolk here. And like, look, listen, I know it seems kind of weird, but like legit guys, there's actually so much aggro on the ladder right now that Nightfall is tier 1 win rate just because it's good at aggro tables. Like, think about it. Nightfall's tier 1. That's basically what the name of the game is. Like, I wasn't joking when I was saying before. Literally just tech the shit out of your decks for aggro and you'll do fine, according to, you know, what's been happening in this last week. Now, obviously, I don't think this is a sustainable process, and maybe I'll cut down on these in a week or 2 from now, but for now, they are great. Right now, this is actually one of the more interesting things happening in the metagame, which is that there's a lot of experimentation going on with Ionia Demacia as an archetype right now, as there should be, because Demacia is arguably the best region in the game right now. It can do a lot of good things, and if you pair it with either Ionia or Targon, it can generate a good aggro matchup, which is great. Not even just right now, but because that's what Demacia is inherently weak to in a lot of cases. And these are some of the best decks in the game right now. The reason this is interesting is because there's a lot of different versions going around. There's people running around with like Lulu Shen decks. There's Lulu Zed decks with Demacia. There's a lot of experimentation happening in these colors, and we'll get to it later, but I actually built my own Lulu Aggro deck in Demacia that I'll show off at the end. But yeah, there's a lot of cool things happening in Ionia Demacia right now. Jarvan Shen is a nice stable one that does well in the stats that I can recommend. All right, next up, we've got Shurima Overwhelm, which is actually pounding the stats at a 54% again. And you'll notice I'm just running Tavern Keeper, and Tavern Keeper is doing really well on the stats because, I mean, it's the same as Feyfolk. Just a couple of Tavern Keepers goes a pretty far way right now. And Tavern Keeper is honestly not bad for Overwhelm in general, because Overwhelm has been really, really light on a 3-drop play for quite some time. But the 1 Sivir version that I updated to a couple of weeks ago, 3 Renekton, 1 Sivir, and 2 Sejuanis, has been doing really well on the stats, so I'm going to keep going with the 1 Sivir version. It's really nice in this deck to have a 4th 4-drop. It's the most important thing with deck building is to be thinking of cards as, you know, not just what the card does, but all of its roles, right? And 1 of Sivir seems kind of weird until you think about it and you're like, okay, we might want a 4th 4-drop in this deck, right? For when we don't have Renekton, which is a common hand that this deck has a problem with, right? And Sivir is really, really good at just being that 4th 4-drop that perfectly fits here, and you never have to double draw Sivir and worry about her champion ability, so it's just a perfect 1 of slot in. All right, next up is Ezreal Draven. This one's actually a little bit of a surprise. This one's made a bit of a comeback on the stats stats as of late, and this is the version that I built with Kuvira just a few hours ago, actually, before recording. Overall, there's nothing terribly fancy, just like some nice efficient ratioing, and we've switched back to Noxian Guillotine because Scorched Earth doesn't really have major landmarks to be killing right now, and there's a lot of situations where Noxian Guillotine's ability to chain is really useful. But yeah, Draven Ezreal is a really classic mid-range deck. Everything about this deck screams mid-range, which means, you know, we have some kinds of aggressive draws, but normally we have a lot of flexibility in terms of the speed at which we're playing. Sometimes this deck will go really ham and, you know, kill you with burn damage over the top. Mostly, it tends to play kind of like a slower, more reactive game plan, farming its Tri-Beam and Probulator by playing a bunch of 3-mana cards, while kind of slowly chipping away at your health and dealing with your threats with its spells, like Ravenous, Flock, and Mystic Shot. Really important, the #1 rule is when you're playing a reactive deck, make sure to play it reactively, right? You want to make sure, you know, that you're taking passes. See here, it says, take passes and let your opponent play first. You usually want to use your cheapest cards first every turn, and both of these are just the idea of playing reactive and keeping your options open. So you should be making sure, and this is true with every reactive deck, but just ask yourself, if I pass here, and if the opponent passes back, am I unhappy? And honestly, in a lot of cases, the answer will be no. So we can take a pass and let them play into us. I can't stress enough how big of a deal this will make if you're playing a reactive deck like a control deck, or even most kinds of mid-range decks in Runeterra. You just want to react to what the opponent's doing instead of the other way around. All right, also sliding into the tier 2 club, we've got Ashe Leblanc, and Ashe Leblanc is a little bit weird. So this is my version of Ashe Leblanc. Actually, I built this one with Kuvira, and it has a really high win rate. It actually has a 56% win rate, but the sample size is a little bit low. I can't quite put it in tier 1 because, you know, obviously win rate can mean a lot of different things in a lot of different contexts. I'm gonna keep it tier 2 for now, but honestly, there's a chance that this deck is hitting pretty big, which is surprising considering that without Kindly Tavern Keeper, it has a pretty awkward aggro matchup. And of course, this deck is just back to running Kindly Tavern Keeper. For those of you guys who have played Ashe Nasus for a while, you probably know that, I mean, whenever there's, you know, a lot of aggro in the meta, you're usually slotting in 1 or 2 Tavern Keeper in this list. So it's only happened a few times that there's, you know, been that much aggro to make you do it, but it's definitely the way to go because it will just make a really, really big difference in that matchup. For the most part, it's a deck that also hasn't really changed. Again, another mid-range deck, and this one happens to be geared towards, you know, a high degree of mostly ability to crush other mid-range decks, right? Like, that's kind of always what this has been famous for. It is the mid-range deck to end all mid-range mirrors, because not only are we playing flexibly for speed, and not only are we playing, you know, for the board and to own the board and to kill the board with our units, but the freezes allow us to basically stop the opponent's attempts at doing the same exact thing to us. For this reason, Ashe, despite being a pretty decent ladder deck, is, if anything, maybe a bit more of a tournament deck because of that property. All right, and then we've got Azir Lucian Scouts. So Azir Lucian Scouts is a deck that I've had to lower. I expected it to be quite a bit better, and basically my downfall, well, okay, so my meta prediction, if you guys watched my last video, basically I expected aggro to be really good, and aggro was really good. So and Azir Lucian Scouts doesn't really have a great aggro matchups. It really depends on the kind of aggro it's facing. So it might have been weird. You might then ask, well, Swim, if you expected aggro to be good and you knew Azir Lucian Scouts didn't have as good of an aggro matchup, why did you expect Azir Lucian Scouts to be good? The biggest reason is because I expected more of a resurgence of anti-aggro counters, like, for example, Lysandra Trundle, which has been spiking this last week, but, you know, it took a while to get there, which Azir Lucian is really good at beating the decks that are trying to beat aggro. Not so good at beating most of the aggro decks itself. But it's still a very powerful deck, and it comes in at a 54% win rate. So right now, I've made literally one change to the deck, -1 Vanguard Redeemer, and +1 Shape Stone, just to slightly smooth out the ratioing a little bit based on what's performing well right now. And it's the same deck. Honestly, this one's not going to be changing much week to week. I can probably skip this one every time just because it's a pretty rigid deck archetype that can only wiggle a couple of cards at the most. For the most part, Azir Lucian is a slower version of aggro that has a really quite terrifying nut draw. When you draw the nuts with Azir Lucian, and hey, I don't need to tell you guys this because I'm sure you guys have been against Azir Lucian players that have nut drawn by like turn 3, but when they curve like Emperor's Deus into Azir with like Lucian somewhere in there, you know, and like you're pretty screwed. Okay, so we're getting to the bottom of tier 2 here. 2 more decks. Pirate Burn. Pirate Burn is actually a little bit lower on the tier list, surprisingly enough. As you guys might have seen last time, it was right up with Spiders. Now it's fallen quite a bit. Now, why is that? Well, Pirate Burn isn't as good in aggro mirrors. I think the most important thing to look at like different aggro decks is that even though, you know, it's all aggro, there are different speeds of aggro, right? Even a deck that tries to play aggro strategy slower is going to have a fairly different matchup into something that's, you know, is still fundamentally an extremely proactive deck, but more disruptible. So what you need to take away is basically this. In an aggro versus aggro matchup, generally speaking, and there are exceptions, but generally speaking, the one that races faster is going to be winning that matchup. In a matchup against something that's trying to counter aggro, the one that slows down tends to be doing better. So an aggro deck that slows down, like Azir Lucian Scouts or Pirate Burn, is unfavored against aggro decks that tend to speed up, like Spiders or Discard Aggro. But the trade-off is these two decks will be better into decks that are trying to counter aggro, like, for example, Lysandra Trundle, or honestly, even decks like Ezreal Draven. I really want to talk more about, you know, matchup tables and just like how metas work in these videos between decks like this, because I think it's super important to understand why things are favored into other things so that you guys will be able to, you know, start making counter picks on your own. But to give Pirate Burn a little bit more of an edge in those matchups, I've gone back to 2 hired guns, which is something that I teched in a while ago. Again, if you've been following the site, you'll see like, you know, decks change periodically, and I back up to 2 hard guns because again, even the aggro decks are kind of teching for the aggro matchup. That's gonna be really, really important. And again, I just want to give you guys the tools to be able to, you know, make these tweaks on your own, because as often as I update the site, a lot of you guys enjoy your own deck building, and there will always be times where, you know, maybe I don't update for a couple of weeks, and I don't want you guys to be lost without me. All right, but there's honestly not too much interesting to say about this deck because it's just Pirate Burn. I mean, it's just like an aggro deck that transitions into burn. That's it. All right, and the final tier 2 deck is Watcher Combo Control, aka Lysandra Trundle. Now, I've switched back to a basically heavier combo version, away from the ice shards that were performing a lot weaker in the stats, kind of like a more classic version of just the full combo package with a little bit of stabilizers. Now, we've got some good anti-aggro here, but for the most part, the core win condition of the Spectral Matrons and the Fading Memories giving you the Watcher is statistically right now the best way to play the deck. And this has been something that, you know, people have been messing around with so many different versions of Lysandra Trundle, even using different second regions than Shadow Isles. And right now, I think I'm pretty confident saying that, you know, the results are pretty much in. You know, you can never be 100% sure, but at this point, the Watcher versions, the all-in Watcher versions with 3 Matron and 3 Fading Memories are doing best. So Watcher, of course, when you've summoned 2+ allies that cost 8, you get your Watcher, and then all you have to do with your Watcher is play 4 things that cost 8, and then it's 0 mana, and you're good. What this means is, well, you can cheat that by playing a bunch of Ice Pillars from Trundle and Fading Memories using your Ice Pillars, and using Spectral Matron on your Watcher. And sometimes you can play 2 Watchers, which is pretty troll, because if you Spectral Matron a Watcher, it counts as 2 8-mana cards, and then you can play your second Watcher for 0 mana, and it's really disgusting. Now, we've gone full deep into the combo with this version, but we've also slowed down into a lot more of the control game plan. We're not running Catalyst of Eons. There's no need to ramp into it right now. We just want the rest of our cards to basically stall out and make sure we aren't dying to a lot of the aggression happening right now. But because of the amount of board sweeps that this deck has access to, Ice Shards is actually proving pretty unnecessary right now, even though it's good against aggro, we've got too many other tools that we don't really need it. And I'm gonna be honest with you guys, the Lissandra Trundle versions that have been on my site for the past but I mean, basically since Lissandra Trundle has been a thing, I guess that's been over a month at this point, they've been some of the less optimized decks on my, probably the least optimized decks on my site, actually. I really pride myself on, you know, having like the most refined decks in the game and sharing them with you guys, but Lissandra Trundle has been a big miss for me. I've been going off by the stats in a lot of cases, and the stats have been jumping wildly around with Lissandra Trundle, so it's been a really hard process to pinpoint, and I apologize for anyone who's had to deal with that mess, because they were some of the weaker versions, and I don't know, I always feel bad just because, I mean, like I said, you know, I'm supposed to be the optimized, you know, deck building guy, but that can happen with some of the more statistically heavy approaches like the ones I've been taking, which are basically, you know, going off by what's popping at the time, only to see that there's just so many rapid fluctuations. I think with control decks in the future, I'll have to tone that down, just because control decks tend to be much more responsive towards what happens to be, you know, going around in the moment. All right, and I wanted to talk about one of the tier 3 decks before we get into the new decks this week, which is Lucian Zoe. So nothing's really changed with this one. I've teched it against aggro a little bit. Haven't actually changed that much, just two tasty favorites. I know, guys, listen. I know it seems like, oh god, he's just putting like plus health in every matchup, but legit, this is straight up the state of plat plus ladder right now. It's just, yes, literally just put like a little bit of healing. I mean, don't go overboard, but this deck gets better for it. And Tasty Faithfolk has been used in Lucian. Again, this isn't even really new. Like, people have run Tasty Faithfolk in this deck before, and it'll happen in times of where there's a lot of aggro. Tasty Faithfolk is great in this deck to buff with Zenith Blade, to be able to protect with some of your buff cards, and there's some weird hands where you'll buff it with like a Mentor of the Stones or something, and it'll do very well. But despite it, Lucian is having a pretty tier 3 win rate right now, and that's important due to, well, it's due to a few different things, but partially because it's, you know, not super great against aggro in general. The two Tasty Faithfolks help a ton, but it's still never going to be amazing as a matchup. And in addition to that, Lucian Zoe is pretty much one of the hardest decks in the game to play. And I think that's something that people tend to kind of overstate, you know, because I hear people talking about how like Lucian Zoe is like the hardest deck to play in the game, and it's definitely one of the harder ones. There's definitely truth to that, but there's a lot of decks that are tricky to play. Lucian Zoe overall, it's still gonna have a high win rate if you are a top Masters player and you're playing it very well, or if you want to bring it in a tournament. It's still gonna be a good deck, especially in a tournament lineup where, you know, you're less worried about aggro. But again, just keep in mind, everything is so situational depending on the metagame, and right now, Lucian Zoe just isn't as good. I don't think it's like long-term a tier 3 deck. It'll probably be closer to tier 2 long-term, but even with aggro out of the way, the deck has never really, I mean, ever since Lucian was just completely broken that one time we don't talk about, the deck hasn't really had a tier 1 win rate. But yep, I just wanted to mention Lucian Zoe because a lot of you guys, you know, might have wondered about that. I'm not going to be talking about the tier 3 decks in general in these videos. If you guys want to check out decks that I'm listing at tier 3, which again is, you know, wouldn't recommend climbing with, but they are climbable, feel free to check out the site. Which brings us to the spice. These are the new kind of experimental concepts that people are doing this week. Some of them are going to be built by me. Some of them are going to be built by, you know, other players on ladder. And, you know, maybe some mix of both. So let's go ahead and start off with New Deep, which is my boy Marcus's version of Deep. Now, Marcus, for those of you guys who don't know, is a pretty high-ranking EU player. He actually has like one of the highest tournament track records in Runeterra, and he's a good friend of mine. He's constantly in Twitch chat, and he's one of the players. So when I do these tier lists and when I, you know, build my decks, I'm often talking with a lot of other top players in the game, and, you know, Marcus is one of the players that I'm constantly getting his opinion on things, and this is his new take on Deep. The moment I saw it, I was like, yep, this is how you build Deep now. So this is a Deep version that has, as you can see, a couple of Beast Belows, heavy on the Abyssal Eyes. It's not running the full control package, but it is running Lure of the Depths, no Slaughter Docs, and the first thing a lot of you guys probably noticed, no Maokai. And at least for the current field right now, what you're expecting to see on ladder, I love each and every one of these decisions. Slaughterdox is just way too slow for, you know, how things are speed right now. It's like a very fast, a very proactive meta. I think Maokai is honestly a fairly baity card in deep. It doesn't really add as much to your synergies. It's somewhat of an alternate win con, but it can lead to a lot of awkward plays for what is meant to be like a super high synergy deck, and doesn't usually end up tossing as many things. And Lure of the Depths has actually been very successful in Deep recently. Deep is a bit of a tournament deck, much more of a tournament deck than a ladder deck in general. It's always had a decent showing in tournaments just because of its unique playstyle and unique color combination, and Lure of the Depths has made a really big resurgence in Deep in the tournament scene. So I'll classify this as experimental, but I think this kind of direction, you know, there might need to be some adjustments to cards. I know some people are teching in a couple more anti-aggro cards, like, you know, a Grasp or a Second Whale. I've seen, you know, some people running like a Crumble here. You can run a couple more spells, but this kind of direction is what I like to see from Deep moving forward in the current meta. And the final deck we've got is the one and only Lulu Aggro. Now, okay, this one, before I show you guys this, just like, look, this is experimental, okay? No judge. Yeah, this is it. This is my current version of Lulu Aggro, and it's actually a pretty interesting archetype. Now, there are some statistics right now on Lulu Demacia decks, and there's quite a few different types of Lulu Demacia. There's a Lulu Zed decks that play really fast. There's Lulu Shen decks that play pretty fast, but just run Shen instead of Zed. And there's Lulu Shen decks that actually are basically just slow, like Shen Fiora, except running Lulu instead, which I think those ones are kind of the weirdest of them all. But this kind of speed is actually pretty good. We're running, in this list you might have noticed, we're running 3 Lulu, 2 Zed, and 1 Shen. And there's a couple of different reasons for this. I'll have to like tweak the ratioing, but for the most part, Lulu is much more central to the ability for this deck to win than Zed. Leveling up Lulu is actually just part of this deck's win condition with the supports. Double drawing Zed isn't great. There's a lot of 3-drops in this deck, but the 1 Shen actually adds a lot of value to a lot of the curves with this deck. We don't have a lot of 4s, so it ends up being quite good. I could even see myself going 1 Zed, 2 Shen maybe. I'll have to play around with it a little bit more, and I might actually play this deck tomorrow on my stream. I say tomorrow, but as you're listening to me say these words, if you're after the video is live, it'll be today. I might be playing this right now on my stream as you watch this on Twitch, on twitch.tv/swimstream. But anyway, the stats for this deck are actually pretty good. Now, I say stats for this deck. Again, it's an experimental deck. We don't know how good this concept will end up being, and we don't know how it'll end up needing to be refined. But Demacia with Lulu, and I've kind of like refined a lot of the versions of the deck, and this is what I've come up with for now. Demacia Lulu is actually doing pretty well on stats. Low sample size, can't be sure, but there's some real potential for this here. I think the fact that Demacia lost Fiora is a really, really big catalyst towards Lulu being maybe an extremely underrated champion. And I don't say that lightly, because don't get me wrong, Lulu is an awkward champion for a few reasons, and her +1 attack didn't really help her out too much, all things considered. But Demacia Ionia is a very powerful region combination and will kind of always be. And now that Shen Fiora no longer has Fiora, it is triggering a massive deck building divergence in Demacia Ionia. Like I mentioned at the start of the video, there's a lot of different versions running around at many different speeds, and the Lulu ones have pretty good win rates. I mean, back in the day, you guys remember when Lulu came out, Lulu Warchefs was pretty solid for a while. I mean, it wasn't the best deck in the game, but it was pretty hype. Now, I think we might be back to that. The thing about Lulu is that as a card, she's never really been bad per se. It's always been her support cards that have been the worst. You'll notice, for example, we're not running Pix in this deck, and that's because Pix is not a great card. So as long as we are kind of like minimizing that and, you know, making a good deck that isn't trying to just like, you know, control F deck build all the support cards, I think Lulu ends up being pretty all right. And yeah, that's it. That's my kind of like weekly, what did I call this at the start of the video? New decks this week? I don't know. I'll figure out something. I have no idea what I'm going to be naming this series. But yeah, let me know what you guys think of the changes. I know it was just like 2, new experimental decks that I was showing off this week, but I think in the future I'll be able to do closer to like 3 or 4 at least. And that'll be kind of like a fun part of this. Yep. Give me feedback if you guys have anything to say about, different ways I could do this, because I'm always kind of trying to constantly improve the format of these videos. You guys might have noticed that in this one, I've been trying to talk a little bit more about like the specific deck building, because I want to respect you guys as deck builders. Here's how content creation works, right? I don't want to just give you guys a net deck, even though that, like, it would probably be best for me if I did that. I want to help you guys start, like, learning at the very least, a lot of the basics to tweak and build your own decks, right? And I think that, this kind of style of talking about specific changes I'm making and why is pretty great for that. Let me know what you guys think, honestly. And if you guys have any other, tips or ideas about what I can do for these videos. And until then, I'll see you guys next time.